Mick Foley and Triple H, two wrestlers that took shortcuts during their time in the WWF, but for very, very different reasons. Guys who, during the time period that I stopped watching, um, worked together a lot, and I've always sort of compared, well, Triple H and Mick Foley have always been sort of perfect contrast to me in regards to not just physically at the time that they worked, but just in their whole sort of success in the WWF. It was they're sort of almost polar opposites because like Mick Foley didn't have a physique. Mick Foley lacked athleticism. His shortcuts that he took were to make up for those things. He had a limited move set, which is why most of the matches you saw Mick Foley in were gimmick matches. Rarely ever did you see Mick Foley in just a regular singles match with rules. Most of the matches he was in were gimmick matches, whether he was working with The Undertaker, whether he was working with The Rock or Triple H. They were almost always gimmick matches to compensate for that lack of athleticism, limited move set. I mean, the mandible claw in and of itself was a shortcut, a move where all you had to do was stick your fingers in somebody's mouth to incapacitate them. It didn't require any athleticism. You could put it on anybody. Like that was the ultimate sort of shortcut move. But although Mick Foley lacked those things, lacked the physique, lacked the athleticism, and had a limited move set, he had great charisma. He was a very likable guy. And that always got him over with audiences, regardless of what persona he had, whether it was Cactus Jack or Dude Love or Mankind. He had the charisma, and he found a way to make whatever was given to him make it work. And he's a tremendously likable guy. That's why even when he started off, when he was given the character of Mankind, he was initially supposed to be a heel to creep people out, but of course eventually Mankind became a lovable babyface because it was only a matter of time with Mick Foley. Mick Foley is one of those guys that even as a heel is very difficult to dislike him, you know. And very few guys have that sort of talent where it's hard to dislike them. And Mick Foley, because of he had a smart mind for the business, he knew his specialty was taking bumps. His willingness to do things that other people wouldn't do. He would take bumps that no other top star in the WWF would take, you know. And that match between Mick Foley and the Undertaker, that Hell in a Cell match that they're so known for, the reason why Mick Foley was thrown off that cage by the Undertaker was because Mick Foley knew in his heart that he and the Undertaker could not top the first Hell in a Cell match between Shawn Michaels and the Undertaker. He knew that match he couldn't top it. What Undertaker and Shawn Michaels did, probably till this day, probably the best Hell in a Cell match. But what Mick Foley could top was the bump that Shawn Michaels took. Shawn Michaels fell off the side of the Hell in a Cell, so Mick Foley wanted to be thrown off the top of the Hell in a Cell. That's what he felt he could take, that he could top. He knew he couldn't top the match, but he could top the bump. And and of course, the second bump of him going through the Hell in a Cell wasn't supposed to happen. And even though for some reason people today talk more about the second Hell in a Cell match than the first one, they talk about it for three things: him going off the Hell in a Cell, through the Hell in a Cell, and the thumbtacks. The match between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels is still a better match, but people talk about the second one more. And simply because of three, and I think a lot of wrestlers today still operate with that mentality that if you take some devastating bump, even if the match isn't great, people are going to remember the bump. That's the mentality so many people operate today. The difference is that Mick Foley, again, his limited athleticism was was the reason why he did that. If Mick Foley had confidence that he and the Undertaker could have a great could top what Shawn Michaels did with the Undertaker, he wouldn't have asked for the Undertaker to do that. And there's a lot of guys today in pro wrestling that are far better athletes than Mick Foley, but still have that mentality of of wanting to thrill the audience just by taking a devastating bump rather than working a match with psychology and telling a story. At the time that Mick Foley did that, though, he was the only guy who thought that way. He stood out because of his willingness to take bumps, because he didn't have that big muscular physique, and because when he was, the hardcore legend on the roster. When it came to main event guys in the WWF in the late 90s, Mick Foley stood out. No other wrestler had the reputation that Mick Foley had. Now, being a hardcore wrestler doesn't you don't in pro wrestling you don't stand out as much because people have hardcore matches and stuff all the time. People have street fights and stuff all the time. Whereas Mick Foley, that was his specialty. That's what he was known for. He stood out from everybody else. And Mick Foley, apart from his willingness to take bumps, Mick Foley helped others. He was great at elevating other wrestlers that he worked with. You know, at the time when he first came to the WWF, he was put in a program with The Undertaker because at the time The Undertaker didn't really have any heels to work with. He came in to help, The Undertaker when it broke The Undertaker away from Paul Bearer and sort of took The Undertaker to a different stage of his character. You know, he was used to help to elevate The Rock when The Rock was being sort of prepared for the WrestleMania 15 match with Austin. Mick Foley saw it as his duty to set The Rock up as a formidable foe for Austin, to help The Rock get over as a heel. And when Mick Foley was planning to retire in 1999, before Austin got his had to have neck surgery, Mick Foley was requested to come back and help build up Triple H as a villain too. And the Royal Rumble 2000 and No Way Out 2000 were all about Mick Foley helping further establish Triple H as a heel. Mick Foley always helped other people out. He had no problem with helping to putting people over and elevating talent around him and doing favors. He had no problem with that. You know, and similar to Triple H, although Mick Foley was a huge star and got over as one of the top stars in the WWF, Mick Foley was never really the draw. He always, like Triple H, Mick Foley was always kind of the guy who worked with the star. Again, even going back to WCW, when he worked with Sting, when he worked with Vader, and even when he came to the WWF working with The Undertaker, when he worked with Austin after Austin won the title, when he was Dude Love, or when he worked with The Rock in the lead up to WrestleMania 15, or Mick Foley was not the draw. He was working with the star. He never saw himself as the star. Even though he was a star, he didn't see himself as. There was never a situation where Mick Foley was a star and the other guy was, working with him. That he was a star. He was the number one draw. He was a star, but he worked with the main star. But like Triple H, that was sort of he's not really thought of that way. But looking back, Mick Foley was that kind of guy who worked with the star, but people kind of forget because he was such a big star. Mick Foley got over on his own. Mick Foley didn't politic behind the scenes. It wasn't necessary for him. Vince McMahon didn't even want Mick Foley, and Jim Ross had to go to bat for him to get him into the company. And even so, Vince McMahon put a mask on him and made it more difficult for him. But again, of course, Mick Foley still made it work. Mick Foley was going to go. Mick Foley's the only guy that I can think of who could have made Socko work. That best epitomizes the talent of Mick Foley, is that he could get something like as ridiculous as Socko over. Now Triple H, on the other hand, Triple H was always really good in the ring. I never questioned his ability as a wrestler in the ring. But at the same time, lots of wrestlers have been good in the ring and never gotten to the main event level. Simply being good in the ring doesn't make you a main eventer. Of course, Triple H in his prime had that great bodybuilder physique, which definitely helped him, especially I'm sure in Vince McMahon's eyes, because Vince McMahon loved bodybuilders so much. But at the same time, Triple H had no charisma. Triple H had no likability, and I know that he, when he became a heel in '99, when he left DX, some people say, "Oh, well, the heel shouldn't be likable." Well, when The Rock was a heel, The Rock was a cool heel. The heel doesn't have to be the type of person who always makes you want to turn the TV off. The heel can still be entertaining, being the heel. Triple H wasn't really entertaining. He was the kind of heel that make you want to turn the TV off. Because usually when I think of the type of heels, I think of monster heels or cool heels, and Triple H wasn't neither one of those. He was just a kind of just a weaselly heel. And in that weaseliness, he was always reliant on an entourage, Triple H. Triple H, he always needed Triple H. It was so difficult because of his lack of charisma, lack of presence. He always had to rely on whether it was China, whether it was DX, or Shawn Michaels, or then later the McMahons. He always needed to have people around interfering in his matches or in promos to take weight off of him because he had so little presence. I mean, China got over before Triple H did. For early on, he was known for being the guy that had the female bodyguard. You know? And in that regard, it always seemed like Triple H, that was Triple H talking about shortcuts. That was always a shortcut. When someone always needs people around him to help him get over because he doesn't have much of a personality. I was like the other members of DX all had more charisma than Triple H did. Billy Gunn, Road Dogg, X-Pac, they all had more charisma than Triple H did. And of course, the stupid sledgehammer sort of again epitomizes that. Like Triple H had this big bodybuilder physique. What did he was 6'4", 260 something pounds, walking to the ring flexing like he's such a badass, and yet he needs a fucking sledgehammer. Like that's just so stupid. Like to me, like that always was stupid to me, even at the time. Like what is that? Why you walk into the ring flexing like that, and then you pull out a fucking sledgehammer to hit people with? What you need a sledgehammer for, as big as you are? Him using a sledgehammer, it would have been as ridiculous as Goldberg or Brock Lesnar using a sledgehammer. What the fuck you need a sledgehammer for when you got muscles like that? It just again, somebody needs props. That means they're lacking something. We need stupid props like that. I mean, you compare Triple H to Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle didn't need props. Kurt Angle wasn't as big as Triple H, but he didn't need a fucking sledgehammer. Like that was ridiculous to me. Like, and of course the sledgehammer is just so phony and just destroys all believability that you expect people to believe that you can hit somebody in the head with a sledgehammer and they're back next week like there was no problem. It was just and it's ridiculous that nobody ever said anything to Triple H about the stupid sledgehammer. And and I said, like Mick Foley, Triple H always worked with the stars. He worked with Austin, he worked with The Rock, he worked with people more popular than him. The difference is that Triple H, his reputation was burying people. The difference between Mick Foley built up people, Triple H buried people. He went out of his way to try to make people look bad. You know, I can't remember really many matches that Triple H had with Mick Foley where Mick Foley actually won. Especially around the period of time that I stopped watching, I can't remember Mick Foley winning a single match. He just lost match after match after match to Triple H as Mankind and Cactus Jack. The The Rock from 1999 to through the year 2000, he'd lost to Triple H countless times. It felt like Triple H used The Rock as a footstool to get to the main event level. Around that period of time when The Rock after The Rock lost the title at WrestleMania 15 and didn't win the title again until Backlash 2000, The Rock lost to Triple H so many times. But because he was so popular, the losses didn't really hurt his popularity, but it did. As a fan, it's kind of hard to have faith in a babyface that loses all the time. It got really annoying because you could feel the Triple H behind the scenes affecting the on-screen product. It just came across to me like Triple H really, really didn't like losing to The Rock. He was really annoyed by the fact that The Rock was more popular than him. And of course, those other examples, like Taz, and people always talk about how when Taz there was such a big reaction when he showed up at the Royal Rumble 2000, and of course Triple H, as soon as possible, made sure to beat him clean in the middle of the ring and be done with him. And the same thing he did when the so-called radicals came to the WWF in the year 2000. And they made sure to beat all of them, and Triple H made sure to beat Chris Benoit and all that and be done with them. And even going up to Unforgiven 2000 when Triple H beat Kurt Angle. A month after that, Kurt Angle would win the title from The Rock at No Mercy. But prior to No Mercy, Kurt Angle had no wins whatsoever over main event level talent. And there was no build to him winning the WWF title. And that Unforgiven, Kurt Angle should have won that match. But Triple H was not going to, in the storyline that involved Triple H, Kurt Angle, and Stephanie McMahon being involved, there was no way in hell that Triple H was going to let Kurt Angle, put Kurt Angle over him under any circumstances. And basically Triple H killed that whole storyline because he was not, and basically buried Kurt Angle, and just it was just over. And even though Kurt Angle still became the champion, it didn't feel Kurt Angle. It didn't feel like he was really an over champion because that was the first time over The Rock. That was the first time he actually beat a main event level guy. Was when he beat The Rock. Had he won over Triple H a month before, you'd have felt like something had been building up, and that's all Triple H. And and again, Triple H always politic behind the scenes. And it went back to even before Triple H was even a main eventer. Because of his connection to Shawn Michaels, he always had Vince's ear, politicking behind the scenes. You have some talent that gets over on their own ability or the fan reaction, and then you have the people who politic behind the scenes. Triple H was the one who politic behind the scenes. That was again another shortcut. And of course, most would consider Stephanie McMahon to be the ultimate shortcut, and Triple H making himself indispensable to the company as he is today. Um, so I say both Mick Foley and Triple H took shortcuts, but very different shortcuts. Mick Foley's shortcuts had all to do with his physical limitations, but in terms of personality, he had no limitations. All of Triple H's shortcuts were to make up for his lack of charisma and stepping on people to get where he wanted to go. That was the primary contrast between Triple H and Mick Foley when it comes to shortcuts. And the fact is, if Triple H was forced to get over the way Mick Foley was forced to get over, Triple H would have never been in the main event picture. If Triple H if he never had China, if he never had DX, if he never had Shawn Michaels, if he never hooked up with Stephanie, he wouldn't be where he is right now. That was all the product of him taking those shortcuts, got him to where he is right now. If he was forced to get over on his own personality and his own ability, he would have never made it. Because there have been plenty of other wrestlers as good as him in the ring who also didn't have personality but never got the push that he got because they didn't politic behind the scenes. No one could tell me that Triple H deserved a push more than Owen Hart. Triple H wasn't better in the ring than Owen Hart, but Owen Hart wasn't a little weasel behind the scenes politicking to make other people look bad and elevate himself. He tried to get over in his own ability, but he wasn't in Vince's ear. And the people who had Vince's ear more than likely were bad mouthing him. But that's another conversation.